The Software Architect's Mindset with Derek Comartin.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast, deliver quality, and run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything the .NET ecosystem has to offer. This episode is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software architecture company that empowers .NET teams to be self-sufficient and able to deliver world-class results. They are hiring architects and .NET engineers who'd like a path to become an architect. And you can go to clearmeasure.com/careers for that. Our guest today on the show is Derek Comartin. He's back with us, previous guest, and he's a software developer with 2 decades of professional development experience. He's written software for a variety of business domains, such as distribution, transportation, manufacturing, and accounting, among others. And Derek also has a very active blog and YouTube channel. You can find it on codeopinion.com, and he focuses on software architecture and design, among other things. Derek, welcome back to the show. How are you, sir?
Thanks for having me again. It's been a little bit of time, but it'll probably kick up right off where we left off.
Right. Hey, the world keeps turning for sure. But you keep up your YouTube channel and your blog posts, and you keep on posting on really intriguing topics that kind of go beyond just programming, and really into why we're doing things. But before we get into that, for people who maybe didn't listen to your previous episode and are just kind of getting to know you for the first time, can you review what are the high points in your background that kind of led you to what you're focusing on today?
Yeah, so I think not any specific moments, but what kind of led to even probably a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is just being a part of organizations, whether they were technology companies or not, but being really, really involved in the solutions and the software that we were building, being directly communicating and connected to people on the business end. I always say this to people, and it sounds really, really weird. I never really had I would say a mentor till kind of the mid part of my career. But what's crazy about that is the mentor that I had, which was just phenomenal, was an accountant.
Nice.
And that usually kind of surprises people, but I always say kind of in writing kind of business systems, line of business, enterprise type style apps, it was the best thing that ever happened to me, was just getting a different perspective. And I don't even know if the accountant was necessarily, like, they were kind of a hybrid of really kind of solution. They just thought very differently, but it gave me more insight into just a lot of business processes, workflows that I didn't really see. I didn't really notice that they were there per se. And it really changed my way of thinking. So it was really insightful.
Nice. I want to pause on that point just to throw out a call to action, because I think there's a lot of people out there listening who hear you say, "Oh, I never really had a mentor," and they're commiserating. It's like, yeah, me either. I hear all this, and nobody coached me. I was just on my own. Because I'm with you, and I my first programming for money job was in 1997, and I didn't have that either. But I did have a boss who was encouraging. And that was huge. It's not like they sat me down and taught me how to program and all that stuff. But so for anyone out there today who's, I don't know, has someone more junior than them, I would just say, get a regular, maybe every other week, 30 minutes, and just do a one-on-one chat. Nothing fancy. Could be over a video call, sit down. It doesn't even matter. And the format, and like your comment as well, the format that I advocate for is just, hey, buddy, what are you working on? Is that falling into place nicely, or are you banging your head against the computer? And then, of course, whatever they say, it's gonna help. And even things I've in recent years, I had two apprentices myself, just because I've formally done that. And I like to ask when they're working on a bug, basic stuff. I'm like a broken record. Have you reproduced it on your box? Well, no, not yet. We reproduced in this environment. Okay. Do you have a fix for it? Yeah, I'm working on the fix. Are you sure that's the problem? Well, of course. Well, have you reproduced it on your box?
Yeah.
Just the same old questions. And invariably, there's at least some wrinkle that they learn by reproducing it on their box. But
Yeah,
what about you?
it's interesting. Like I said, I don't necessarily know that it has to be somebody directly in writing software. Like I said, for me, I guess in that scope of writing software, but generally for obviously for different, lines of business and different domains, it was talking with somebody that has done the same type of thing in various different organizations and just had a whole different way of looking at the organization, what we were working on, kind of the problems even there, in different domains. It was really fascinating. And it gave me a whole different outlook pretty much as a developer.
Well, there are just massive amounts of programmers that are new to the industry. There's probably new data out there, but we have the Stack Overflow surveys of new developers in there. I think that suggests that just in the past 6-7 years, we've doubled in the number of
Yeah.
people writing programs actively, which means that half the people out there have fewer than 6-7 years of experience.
Yep.
So what would you say to those people who are just starting out, where their mindset is, I got to get this working?
It's interesting, right? Because I do use that reference to Stack Overflow because there are so many people getting into the industry. And on the bright side of things, there's so much information available to people now, like, through blogs, YouTube, et cetera, courses. It is the fire hose. And I find the difficult thing, and this is a lot of the reasons why I blog and create videos, it kind of feels like a double-edged sword here because I'm adding more content. So it's like, how do you decipher what's, I don't want to say right or wrong, like what's correct maybe, or when you start looking into certain things, is that our industry does have this this tendency to kind of change the meaning of things over time. So Martin Fowler on his Blicky he calls this semantic diffusion, which is there's terms that kind of originate somewhere, either by an individual or like either from a book or a group of people. And then just as that term or concept gets spread wider and more adopted, it kind of just lose a lot of its definition and a lot of its meaning. And because of that, I feel like that is a real culprit in trying to how you decipher what information is quote unquote correct or not correct. So a lot of the content I post, I don't necessarily focus on the language specific or framework specific things. I do ultimately try to show examples in almost always in C#. But a lot of it is more just higher level conceptual ideas that a lot of times aren't necessarily overly technical. They are things that happen in the real world. I posted something recently about the reservation pattern, which was something that happened to me in real life. And I immediately related to something that you can then apply in software, but we don't necessarily think of, there's all these processes in the real world that happen all the time. And we just don't necessarily relate them and how they can help us in the solutions that we're writing. So like, as an example of that is I ordered something online, and it was at a big box store, and it showed that the quantity for the product that I was ordering, there was only one left at my local store. And I wanted to just go pick it up. So instead of me hoping that quantity on hand number is right, I ordered it online for pickup. So I immediately get the email saying, okay, we'll email you back once we've confirmed your order and that we have that product, and then you can come pick it up. which makes sense because I've worked in warehousing and distribution. Is like what a system says the quantity on hand is doesn't necessarily mean that's actually what's physically on the shelf.
Right.
So what ultimately has to happen there, right, is there's a reservation happening. There is an employee at that store, received my order that I placed, went and physically got the item off the shelf, assuming it was there, which it was, thankfully, and then brought it to some designated area, either, I think it was actually kind of at the front of the store, that nobody could take the item, and it was specifically they were reserving it for me. So once they've done that, they clearly do something in their system saying, okay, we've reserved this item. I get another email saying, okay, it's ready to go. You can come pick it up. And once I go pick it up, I could kind of complete that process and the reservation is done. But an interesting part of that was in the email also states that if I don't pick up the item after 7 days, that the item will go back onto the shelf for somebody else to buy, and I'll just be refunded my money. And that type of pattern is oftentimes it exists in the real world, but we don't necessarily translate that to different places in software that we're trying to do that exact same thing. We just don't realize that it's actually a thing in the real world.
Yeah.
So I use the example of the reservation pattern for if you're in a kind of a scenario, especially now where things are more distributed. And if you have different services involved in kind of exactly that, this long running business process where there needs to be some type of unique constraint on something that, like my example was using like a registration, a user registration, say of a username, is that maybe there's different services involved. And how do you keep that unique constraint? If this was easy, if you're just using a single database and you do what you need to do, and if something fails, you roll back and we're done. But if you have different services involved, how do you keep this consistency of, okay, I need to register this username and I don't want any concurrency issues where I end up with a duplicate? And it's really, as one solution, is kind of using this reservation pattern of kind of mimicking and modeling that flow in that process, but just doing it in software. So that's a lot of the things that I try to focus on is that there's more to if statements, right? And how, like, a lot of it is organizing code. And I'm not saying that isn't a focus. Like how you know your tools, how you know your programming languages and your frameworks obviously are very important. But there's this other side of it, which is what is the actual software trying to do? Like, obviously I'm a big advocate for domain-driven design. And as people get in that, there's a lot of questions that come up there, obviously. But there's this whole focus, I feel like, especially for beginners, on here's how to get the technical nitty-gritty down. And it is important. Like, obviously, if you're starting into writing software, you have to write it.
Yep.
But I feel like there's this whole kind of separate conversation that's lacking around kind of that mindset of, if you're writing software for businesses, really understanding what the business is trying to do.
Yeah.
Rather than just just focus on code.
And you mentioned your Martin Fowler reference. Words have meaning.
Yeah.
And if we don't agree on what they mean, then we can't really communicate. And domain-driven design focuses on that ubiquitous language. With the reservation of the order, going back to when I was a really young programmer, I remember just having the thought of doing what I thought was probably the right thing because I had that hunch, versus thinking, oh, that's going to be hard. And if I already had a database and I already had different code that was in order, I would be really tempted in that mindset to just say, let me just add one more column to this order table, and maybe it can be a status of is reservation order or not, versus, oh, this isn't an order. This isn't something where we can flow it onto a reporting database and know that these are order. No, this is basically a request or a promise to order. It's a different thing. And so I really should probably have a different table in this database and different set of objects to do it properly. Oh, but and especially if you don't have those things automated, where, now I got to go to every environment and create a new table in the database. I don't want to do that. Let me just do this instead. And then over time, you do that again and again and again, and then the system just becomes confusing.
It is. You're kind of leading down the way here. Is exactly that. Is there's this initial kind of mindset of, I like to call it really is kind of crud driven. So you're just thinking a lot of what nowadays I call entity services, which are people have these idea of, okay, I have this entity, say it's the order, and everything really revolves around kind of CRUD operations around that. So like you're saying, adding just a new column, and then there's some status change that's done to that. Rather than, and again, it's context specific, it's situational, depending on what your system does, what your app does, et cetera, is like you just alluded to, is it that, or is it really this? Is it really this reservation, or is it really kind of this request for something? And when you do talk to end users of the business, to whoever you're writing the system for, it becomes abundantly clear that it's not necessarily just the column. Like there's other intricacies that are involved here. And that's, I think, where a lot of this can go is just, it's more focus or more paying attention to kind of that language that the business uses, and really taking, if you can, depending on kind of the situation that you're in. I know that I get a lot of comments from people saying, well, how do you go and talk to end users, or how do you go talk to the business about the software that you're writing? And that's difficult. And if you're in kind of a situation where you are kind of viewed as just the cog in the wheel of not really needing to understand these things, so that's a difficult situation to be in, because what I'm advocating, it's really not going to work there. But really getting a really fundamental idea of what is actually trying to be accomplished, and then trying to kind of model problems around kind of that language, that behaviors of what the solution is, like what the business is actually, some of the workflows are actually trying to happen. I usually say CRUD can be great at the very beginning when you're kind of trying to figure everything out. But it's kind of a death by 1,000 paper cuts, where you start adding more and more complexity because you start understanding more and more of it. And it becomes, at some point, really unmanageable. My analogy to this is, especially if you're kind of new to whatever domain it is, that I think of it like you're walking to a dark room that's pitch black and you can't see anything. And that's your knowledge. You know nothing, basically. And you just have a little flashlight and you're just kind of shining it around to kind of get the landscape of what that room is. Like, how big is the room? Like, what's on the floor? Is it carpet? Is it tile? Whatever the case may be. Like, how tall are the ceilings? And as you kind of shine it more, you get more context. You understand more. And as you do that, that's where you kind of need to revisit and evolve what you're actually building. Because you're not going to know everything at the beginning. And I always tell people, you're going to get it wrong. Like, you're just going to get it wrong. It's being aware of kind of those insights and those aha moments we all have of like you were saying, like, oh, I could do it this way, but maybe there's something more to this. So I think a lot of that plays into it, is kind of just as you progress through your career, and depending on the circumstance you're in, if you get more involvement of kind of being on the business side, of understanding really what the business is trying to accomplish with the software that you're writing, I think it can take you not just to writing better software, but if you end up moving into a different company and they're in a different domain, there's a lot of these things that translate, and it makes it easier. They're not the same, but there's definitely a lot of overlap.
Yeah. I think I have worked in a couple of environments where there was a barrier to talk to actual customers, and in one case, even product management, just because of personalities, and it was considered stepping on somebody's toes. But that was when I was in the role of just an individual contributing programmer. I wasn't an architect. I wasn't even a senior engineer. And so that can be tricky if you're thinking, well, shoot, the people senior to me, they're not talking to the customer either. And I know we should. And that's a whole nother dynamic. But what advice would you have in that situation?
Well, yeah, like I mean, I think you could be just an individual contributor, and even if even if your amount of communication is with just your team, and whether that be a product owner be a part of that, or just I mean some lead, it's beyond it's trying to understand what you're actually doing, like what's the intent of what you're doing, even if it's just from them. Because I feel like there's this tendency, especially if you want to progress, to understand, I guess, more from a design perspective of what you're actually trying to accomplish. Because at the end of the day, for me, and a lot of the stuff that I post, there's this underlying thread that you could probably find in everything that I post, which relates to coupling. Everything does. Everything generally comes back to this. So, and there's different ways that I talk about it, but if you understand from kind of the business point of view, the business workflows and what belongs where, it really is that it's kind of coupling and cohesion and what relates to what and what's kind of different. Like when I was using the example of the reservation, there's multiple things going on there. So if you're trying to build that and you don't really know what the reason behind, oh, well, why would we need to reserve something and then refund them after 7 days? Like, you would actually kind of need to understand the business workflow for you to be able to implement anything that is going to kind of be able to change or be able to adapt if you do get it wrong or if the business changes. So there's just kind of this, if you're kind of static on, I'm going to implement this with very little knowledge of why, I think you kind of end up more in that place where stuff becomes ultimately more difficult to change in the long run.
Yeah.
I say that like, I feel like everybody on a part of a team should be involved in the design and architecture. That's not to say that everybody should have equal amount of weight in what they're saying, but even from just an understanding of the decisions that are made and the trade-offs that are being made by the people actually making decisions, so that you can kind of get a sense of, oh, these are the things, I never thought of that. And that's not to say you might not have input. That is completely valid, right? That's giving an outside perspective. Oh, well, that makes sense too. But I feel like everybody can have input. And even if that input is just soaking it all in and trying to get like a better understanding of what the problems are. And then depending obviously on the size of the organization, there may be people above that are trying to deal with how different parts of the system are communicating. So I still think there's still that role. I know there's always this debate on, I mean, does the title of software architect exist? And I think there can be, but I think if we're just talking about an individual team, I think everybody can have or share some of the responsibilities. And like I said, that may be just providing minor feedback. It may be having more of an impact in terms of actually making the decisions. But I think everybody can play a part, at least in understanding what you're trying to accomplish.
Many thanks to our podcast sponsor, ClearMeasure. ClearMeasure is a software architecture company that empowers clients' development teams to be self-sufficient, moving fast, delivering quality, and running their systems with confidence. Whether starting a new project or developing new technologies or techniques, ClearMeasure sets up your team to deliver world-class results. Learn more at www.clearmeasure.com. ClearMeasure, empowering software delivery.
There's, in some places, interpersonal issues where, you know, different people have different analysis skills, and maybe the brain goes quickly down 5 different paths and come back and already has the answer, whereas other people just think at a different pace. But product managers, some of those also have really good logical analysis skills. Others are just really awesome at knowing the actual end customer and knowing the market, but they might not. Everybody's different. But one thing that I've seen hurt programmers' trust is getting frustrated if somebody doesn't think like them. And the product manager will say, all right, it needs to do this, and in this situation needs to do that, and it always needs to do this. And of course, somebody immediately sees a conflict in logic. Well, and they just blurt out, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. As opposed to questioning in a way that's helpful. For example, okay, hey, in this situation, when the user does A, but then this other user does B, in that situation, what should the system do? Because then it's a question where they can see, oh yeah, that doesn't make sense. Okay, let's think about it more. And as opposed to, that's just not going to work. And then you're just beating heads.
Yeah, and I think there's two pieces to that too. There's oftentimes, I think I'm a developer, so I'm gonna speak like one, which is there's this tendency, I think, I know I have it, which is that every kind of edge case that I can think of or every use case is covered, right? And the reality of it is that's actually not the case all the time. Is if we can, for whatever we're trying to work on, maybe the 90% works. Maybe that other 10% isn't something we support immediately. And it's more comes down to notifying an end user that they need to deal with this use case, because the amount of effort that we need to spend technically to solve that problem just doesn't come up that much. And we can deal with it in a different way that isn't necessarily solved by code. So yeah, it's coming up those use cases, but not all of it has to be solved necessarily by code.
Yeah, isn't it liberating just to say, you know what? I think that's not going to be supported. Let's just put a message. Let's solve that requirement with an error message.
It may be like that. That's a conversation to have, right? Yeah. Instead of just assuming everything is, oh, this needs to be taken care of. This. What about this? What about this? I think those what ifs are useful, obviously, to be acknowledging, but the solution to them, one solution may not actually be to implement it in code. The other one is, I guess, somewhat related to that, is trying to find a solution to a problem that you don't necessarily need to have. So just looking at it saying, okay, like we have this problem, you're coming up with all the solutions. One of the solutions that you may come up with is, why are we in this situation in the first place? Why do we have this problem? And I feel like that one comes up quite a bit, especially when it is kind of in what I was alluding to that first place, where we're just trying to solve that every problem under the sun. And like, that's kind of the focus. Okay, I could fix this with this code. We can do this. We can do this. And regardless of the amount of potential complexity that we're adding to it. So there's these trade-offs of maybe we've gone down this one route that is introducing this technical problem or business problem that we're trying to solve, that maybe if we back up a little bit and look at this a little bit differently, we don't even have this problem. Like it's a non-factor. So I think that's one thing I would try to advocate more for is why do we have this problem in the first place? Because I find that one comes up quite a bit, especially from some of the comments and just different conversations I have with people. Is I feel like that we kind of get ourselves into that corner a little bit.
Well, that comment made me think about the reservations and just automatically canceling somebody's reservation if they don't pick it up in a certain time frame. There's a philosophy I've seen shift and not be consistent over the last 20 years, where at one point I remember people telling me when I was a lot younger, everything that a software system does needs to be done on behalf of a human being, so that when something goes wrong, we know who to talk to. And I think it's the same principle of the self-driving cars. It's right now, we're not recognizing a car as an entity. And if the car hits somebody, we go and talk to a person. It's like, hey, your car caused this damage. Your car hurt somebody. It's your fault. You are responsible for operating that machine. Where I've seen some computer systems these days and language start to shift where we say the system did this, and everybody's like throwing their hands up in the air. Oh, I didn't do it. The system did it. And then what does that mean? Well, that means that the developers end up effectively becoming an actor in the business, and questions roll up to them like, why'd you do? So what's your philosophy on when the software does something, who actually did it?
That's interesting, because I hadn't really thought about it like that. But I can definitely relate to it. And a lot of this pertains to, I think, for myself and relating to kind of systems and event-driven architecture and things being derived from events where we have different consumers handling events and then acting out accordingly and reacting to them. And it's, well, who did that? Well, the initial user did something, made some type of state change to perform some action that derives some event that we're consuming somewhere else. And is that really that consumer that, you know what I mean, that process that picked that up, that had to do something? Who do we relate that to? Do we relate that to the user that triggered this whole thing, like that caused it? It's interesting. I don't know if I've really ever thought about it like that, but I definitely can relate to this because it is something that I think, I'm trying to think of exact use cases that I have here. And most of those cases, we end up trying to surface, especially that issues that are, I guess you couldn't say are directly related to a user. It's letting end users know that those things have occurred, especially if it's something that negatively impacts whatever they're working on. And that has lately for me has always been a struggle, which is trying to surface this stuff in a meaningful way that is kind of happening in the background, unbeknownst to anybody, that, oh, there's things going wrong here and you need to know about it.
Well, with your reservation example, I think that there could be two schools of thought, and of course conversations for whoever's doing product management. And it's asking the question, okay, we want 3 days, 7 days. If they haven't picked it up in some period of time, then our policy is that we're not going to hold it for you anymore. That's kind of the business conversation, right?
Yep.
So we have to translate that into the computer. It's like, oh yeah, we can have an automatic job that's running a timer that's doing this, and we can just automatically flip that bit and whatnot. Okay, we could. And then a different way to think about it is, well, no, there's a person responsible for inventory, and on a daily basis, maybe we have a shelf of all these things that are on hold for this customer. Yeah. And on a daily basis, you know what? I need a screen with unpicked up reservations. And I'm going to make a human decision. Most of the time, I click the button that says cancel late reservations, cancel no pickups, or whatever you call it. And of course, and when they hit the button, that's when we actually do it in the computer versus a under the covers back end job because then someone says, hey, I had something come up. I had a death in the family and I showed up at the store and it didn't have it and you sold it to somebody else. Well, hold on. Let me give it to the developer. Let's or after the fact, let's look at the logs. Let's see what happened. It's like, so that kind of thing, I see the power, and you can't do that all the time, but I see the power of just letting a real person at the store hit a button. Even if the whole list of expired reservations is curated for them, and even if most of the time they don't even review it, they just say, oh yeah, do it.
Yeah, because they're ultimately, if the system were automatically doing it, somebody ultimately has to go put that item back on the shelf.
Yeah.
To say that it happened. And likely that is the thing that's actually triggering, okay, I need to cancel the order, I need to put that this item is back in inventory. And that's actually an interesting example too, kind of segue, is when I worked in distribution, the immediate, if you're kind of naive to it, and even the example of this store, like I was alluding to at the very beginning, saying, oh, the inventory on hand when I went to go order the product said 1. As developers, we would think, oh, well, that is the point of truth. No, that is not the point of truth. The point of truth is whether that item is actually on the shelf.
Right.
Like whether, or if it's damaged, it may not be any good at all. Maybe there's actually 2.
If the lamp fell on the floor, it may be on the shelf, all beat up, but we can't sell it.
Exactly. There's different things in terms of, unfortunately, theft and miscounting when they do end up doing type of like recounts and stock counts. So I guess that just where I'm going with this is another example of we as developers kind of think a certain way of, like you're saying, this could be automated or this quantity on hand is the real point of truth, but in reality, it's not.
Yeah.
And the example of the quantity on hand one, I had that assumption before actually getting into that space and then realizing through somebody part of the business telling me no, like that's not how it works.
Yeah.
And we can't take this number as being the be all end all. And what you learn from that as well is there's different, because of things have been done on paper so many years ago to keep track of these things, is that they already have kind of processes that handle all these things. So in terms of, like, again, when we go back to the warehouse, I use this example a lot, is if you're in sales and you want to sell a particular item, say it's even just e-commerce, and you want to show some quantity on hand, that isn't just what we think it is. It's a combination of things. It's a combination of what have we recently purchased from, say, the vendor, the supplier, but we just haven't received yet. And so that becomes a part of the equation. What items have we sold that we haven't invoiced yet? So there's kind of in this state. And it's called available to promise, but there's these processes, these business functions that actually exist. And rather than, I guess, developers thinking, oh, there's this consistency on this way these works between these systems. Again, if going back to the actual business, is that they already have all these things in place. And it's really about modeling that rather than what maybe we think how it would work, and being a little naive to it.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah. Any organization that's been around for any number of years has already had these conversations.
Yeah. Many times. Yeah. But that's where I go back to how I think the accountant had the biggest impact on me. Was I got to learn more about the business side of things, more about, I call it how the money flows, especially backwards from an accountant's point of view.
Right.
And seeing how everything transpires, where revenue comes from, how that all flows, where cost comes from. There's just a lot of stuff that you can see from that perspective. And I do really feel this way. This is just, again, my experience, is that some of the best developers I've talked with or have worked with have this unique combination of technical skill and this business acumen or knowledge. Like, they're very business savvy, but they are equally, or as, I can't say sometimes they're more than one side or the other, but they definitely kind of have this balance between the two. And I think it's, again, if you're working in kind of this type of work where you're writing business software, obviously having a lot of business knowledge is going to be helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. And some developers early in their careers, I've seen, myself being one of them, hated what I could just call meetings. Hated just sitting around, people talking, boring, nothing gets done. And so, but developers who actively avoid any kind of meeting, they just don't even get to be part of the conversation. And it's a miss.
Yeah, I think so. Like I said, I guess it depends. A lot of this is contextual, based on how the company works, that you know what I mean, the organization. I've just been lucky enough where I've always been a part of small teams, mainly startups. And it's always been able to just get that flood of knowledge about kind of the business side of things. And I think it's helped me, I guess, in designing systems and building systems, think about more of the bigger picture. Because a lot of them have been all of them have been really long-lived type of systems that the intent of them was to kind of hopefully stand for a while, right, a little bit of the test of time. So I feel for the people that are in a situation where they want to do what I'm saying, they want to get this knowledge, but it's just really difficult to do so based on, I guess, the circumstance that they're in.
Yeah. Well, so many examples that you've brought up here in our conversation come back to what the question in my head seems to be phrased as asking, what is that really? In all these different contexts, is that really an order? What is that? No, it's not quite. Reservation. Okay. And just asking over and over, making sure we understand, what is this really? Is this really an order just with a different status, or is this kind of a different thing? And then if it's a different thing, let's talk more about what it is and what it isn't. And like accounting, loans are like that. And it's so easy when someone puts in a loan application We have a loan table in the database. Do loans have a status of application pending, being decided on? No. You have a loan application. And guess what? Probably a large amount of loan applications will never, ever become a loan. Things like that. It's like, what is this really?
Yeah, there's these workflows, there's these business processes that, and that's the thing is that I usually find that they're finite, but they span different people, different people kick off different things that like they hand off, like this business process is done by this department or these people. And then that kind of gets kicked off to the next group of people. And even then, like I say that as a department, but it could be, even if you're writing an application or a system that is for a small company, that overlying kind of like these different parts even apply to single individuals. They're just wearing multiple hats at any given time, right? They may be doing sales, they may be doing purchasing, but they're still kind of different things, and they just context switch when they're dealing with it. So whether it's a large organization or a smaller one, there are still kind of these boundaries about in business processes that kind of reside individually in areas, as well as kind of span kind of this usually like this finite kind of life cycle. And yeah, I keep harping on it. It's kind of fundamentally trying to understand these things.
Yeah. Nice. Wow. That was pretty deep. It was a really, really good topic. As we close up, are there any, besides, codeopinion.com and whatnot, are there any resources that you would suggest people go to or check out if they want to kind of dig in deeper and springboard off of this discussion?
Yeah, I think YouTube's always, and blogs are always a good resource. The ones that I usually try to keep an eye on are a lot of conference talks now are posting on YouTube, say after the fact, they'll post some. Some of the really great ones are usually, for me, always around domain-driven design. And I say that not necessarily because they are domain-driven design topics per se, but a lot of them are more, I'll call them experience reports, where they're talking a lot about what we were kind of alluding to with the reservation, where people work on projects that are in a particular domain and they kind of explain kind of the troubles or the problems and the solutions and how things were modeled. And I find those really interesting. So I would say those, like if you search on YouTube, there's like different domain-driven design concerts. Explore DDD was one of them from a few years ago. Hopefully since COVID now, hopefully they get kicked off and have a live event again soon. But those are the types of resources that I find really useful. Are more, and I wish more people did them, is kind of those experience reports, kind of case studies about different domains and sharing more of that.
Awesome. Good stuff. All right. Well, Derek, appreciate you coming back on the show and talking with us about a software architect's mindset. I think this will be a hugely valuable conversation for lots of programmers. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on again.
And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.